The black wall rose from the horizon like the wrath of God himself, swallowing the Kansas prairie in a darkness so complete that noon became midnight in the span of heartbeats. Eleanor Whitman pressed her face against the train window, watching the approaching dust storm with a mixture of terror and fascination. The locomotive's whistle shrieked a warning that seemed pitiful against nature's roar. "All passengers, brace yourselves!" the conductor shouted as he stumbled through the swaying car. "We're heading straight into her." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor gripped the wooden seat, her knuckles white beneath her cotton gloves. In her lap, the letter from Samuel Morrison crinkled as her hands trembled. Prosperity, Kansas. Population 847, growing every day. That's what he had written. A thriving town with a bright future, ready to welcome a refined lady from Boston who could bring culture and grace to the frontier. The train lurched violently as the storm's leading edge struck. Sand and grit pelted the windows like rifle fire, and the car plunged into an eerie twilight. Eleanor could taste dust through the sealed windows, feel it settling on her skin despite the closed compartment. Around her, other passengers coughed and covered their faces with handkerchiefs. For 3 days, she had been traveling west, leaving behind the familiar cobblestones of Boston for the promise of a new life with a man she had never met, Samuel. Morrison's photograph showed a respectable gentleman with kind eyes and a confident smile. His letters spoke of love, partnership, and a future built together in the growing town of Prosperity. He owned the largest general store, served on the town council, and promised Eleanor a comfortable home with modern conveniences. Now, as the train fought through the howling darkness, Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The storm seemed endless. For what felt like hours, the locomotive crawled through the black wall, its engines straining against winds that threatened to derail the entire train. Passengers huddled together, some praying, others weeping quietly. An elderly woman across the aisle clutched a Bible, her lips moving in silent supplication. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to remember her decision to leave Boston. The death of her father had left her with mounting debts and dwindling options. At 24, she was considered a spinster by society's standards, too old for most suitors and too proud to accept charity from distant relatives who had made their disapproval of her independent spirit abundantly clear. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like providence. Successful businessman seeks a refined lady for matrimony, beautiful home and prosperous future guaranteed. Only serious inquiries from ladies of good character and education. Samuel Morrison's subsequent letters had painted a picture of Western opportunity that beckoned like a beacon. He described Prosperity as a growing town with tree-lined streets, a new schoolhouse, and families seeking to build something lasting on the frontier. He spoke of evening concerts in the town square, literary societies, and plans for a proper church with stained glass windows. Most importantly, he had seemed to genuinely want a partner, not merely a servant. His letters revealed a man who valued intelligence and conversation, who promised Eleanor would have a voice in their shared decisions and room to pursue her own interests. After years of watching Boston society dismiss her as too opinionated, too independent, Samuel's appreciation for her spirit had felt like water in a desert. The train's whistle blew again, a different note this time. Hope rather than warning. Eleanor opened her eyes to see the darkness gradually lightening. They were emerging from the storm's heart, though dust still swirled outside the windows like a brown fog. "Prosperity Station, next stop," the conductor called, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Prosperity, Kansas." Eleanor's heart hammered as she gathered her belongings. 2 trunks in the baggage car contained everything she owned, her father's books, her mother's china, the few pieces of jewelry that had survived the creditors. In her carpet bag, She carried Samuel's letters and the small daguerreotype he had sent, a new life reduced to portable possessions and a stranger's promises. The train wheezed to a stop at what should have been Prosperity Station. Eleanor peered through the dust-caked window, trying to make sense of what she saw. Where buildings should have stood, only skeletal frames remained. The platform was buried under drifts of sand and debris. A sign reading Prosperity hung at a crazy angle, half buried and nearly illegible. "This can't be right," she whispered, pressing closer to the glass. The conductor appeared at her elbow, his face grim. "I'm afraid it is, miss. The storm that just passed through. It's been building for days. Looks like Prosperity took the worst of it." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She could see other structures in the distance, or what remained of them. Rooftops protruded from massive sand dunes. A church steeple lay toppled across what might once have been a street. Windows gaped like dead eyes in buildings that had been scoured down to their bones. "The people," she managed. "What happened to the people?" The conductor shook his head. "Can't say, miss. Storm like that. Folks either got out early or..." He didn't finish the thought. Eleanor stumbled off the train on shaking legs, her boots sinking into sand that had drifted knee-deep across the platform. The air was thick with dust that burned her throat and stung her eyes. She could barely make out the other passengers disembarking, coughing and covering their faces as they struggled through the devastation. This was supposed to be her new beginning, this wasteland of buried dreams and shattered hopes. She pulled Samuel's last letter from her pocket, reading it again through the haze. "Meet me at Morrison's General Store on Main Street. You'll know it by the blue awning and the flower boxes in the windows. I'll be waiting with a bouquet of prairie roses and the biggest smile in Kansas." Eleanor looked around desperately, trying to orient herself in the transformed landscape. Nothing matched Samuel's descriptions. Where Main Street should have been, she saw only undulating dunes of sand punctuated by debris. A child's toy wagon protruded from one drift. A rocking chair sat perfectly upright in another, as if waiting for someone to return. "Excuse me," she called to a man struggling with his luggage nearby. "Do you know where Morrison's General Store might be?" The man looked at her with pity. "Lady, there ain't no store left standing. There ain't much of anything left standing." He gestured toward the devastation. "This town is done for." Eleanor felt the world tilting beneath her feet. She had burned her bridges in Boston, spent her last savings on the train ticket, and pinned all her hopes on a future that no longer existed. Samuel Morrison, if he had survived, was nowhere to be found. The comfortable home he had promised was buried under tons of Kansas soil. She was alone in a dead town, with nowhere to go and no way to get there. The train whistle blew again, preparing to depart. Other passengers were climbing back aboard, their faces masks of disappointment and relief. Whatever business had brought them to Prosperity would have to wait or be conducted elsewhere. "All aboard," the conductor called. "Next stop, Dodge City." Eleanor took a step toward the train, then stopped. She had no money for another ticket, no destination that would welcome her, no plan beyond the hope that Samuel Morrison would take care of everything. The train began to move, picking up speed as it left the devastation behind. She stood alone on the buried platform, watching her last connection to the outside world disappear into the dust-haze distance. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the ruins and the distant creak of damaged timber settling. Eleanor had faced hardship before. Her father's long illness had taught her about making difficult decisions with limited resources. The months of managing creditors and selling possessions had shown her she was stronger than she had believed. But this was different. This was starting over with nothing in a place where nothing remained. She picked up her carpet bag and began walking into the ruins, searching for any sign of life, any clue about what had happened to Samuel Morrison and the 847 people who had called Prosperity home. The sand was treacherous beneath her feet, hiding obstacles and shifting with each step. Her traveling dress, suitable for meeting a fiancé at a train station, was entirely wrong for trudging through a disaster zone. A flash of color caught her eye. There, half buried in a drift, lay a bouquet of prairie roses, their petals scattered, but still recognizable. Eleanor's heart clenched as she knelt to extract them from the sand. The stems were tied with a blue ribbon that matched the color Samuel had described for his store's awning. He had been here. He had been waiting for her, just as he had promised. But where was he now? "Samuel!" she called, her voice swallowed by the empty air. "Samuel Morrison!" Only echoes answered her, bouncing off the broken walls and buried foundations. Eleanor clutched the scattered roses to her chest, feeling tears she had held back since Boston finally spilled down her cheeks. The dust turned them to mud, streaking her face with the same brown devastation that had claimed everything else. She was a mail-order bride who had arrived to find her ordered life destroyed, a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles to discover that sometimes even the most careful plans could be buried under forces beyond human control. The sun was setting, though it was hard to tell through the dust that still hung in the air. Soon it would be dark, and Eleanor would be alone in this graveyard of a town with no shelter, no food, and no idea what had become of the man who had promised to build a life with her. She thought of the other passengers who had wisely returned, to the train, who would reach Dodge City with stories of the destruction they had witnessed. She thought of her Boston relatives who had predicted her Western adventure would end in disaster. She thought of the comfortable boarding house room she had given up, the teaching position she had declined, the safe but limited life she had abandoned for the promise of something more. All of it was gone now, buried as thoroughly as prosperity itself under the weight of her choices and the random cruelty of nature. But Eleanor Whitman was still standing. Scared, lost, and covered in dust, but standing nonetheless in the ruins of her carefully constructed dreams. Whatever came next, she would face it, as she had faced everything else. With determination born of necessity and strength, she was still discovering she possessed. The wind picked up again, stirring the dust and carrying with it the scent of rain. In the distance, something moved against the darkening sky. Not the familiar shape of buildings or trains, but something else. Someone else. Eleanor was not as alone as she had thought. 6 months earlier, Eleanor Whitman had been a different woman entirely. She sat in the morning room of her father's Beacon Hill townhouse, sunlight streaming through tall windows as she read aloud from Tennyson to Professor Marcus Whitman, who lay propped against pillows in his wheeled chair. The consumption had taken most of his strength, but his mind remained sharp as ever, and their daily reading sessions were among the few pleasures left to both of them. "Come not when I am dead to drop thy foolish tears upon my grave," Eleanor recited, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "To trample round my fallen head, and vex the unhappy dust thou wouldst not save." Professor Whitman smiled, weakly. Tennyson understood the burden of the living, didn't he? The way guilt can chain us to the dead more surely than love ever could. Eleanor closed the book, marking their place with a pressed violet from their garden. "Papa, you're not dead yet, and I have no intention of being chained by anything when you do pass. You've taught me to be too independent for that." It was true. Marcus Whitman had raised his daughter with the unconventional belief that women possessed minds every bit as capable as men's. After Eleanor's mother died when she was 7, he had educated her himself, sharing his vast library and his passion for literature, history, and natural sciences. While other girls her age learned embroidery and deportment, Eleanor mastered Latin, studied astronomy, and debated philosophy with her father's university colleagues. The result was a young woman admirably suited for intellectual discourse and woefully unprepared for the marriage market that awaited Boston ladies of her social class. At 24, Eleanor had received exactly 3 marriage proposals, all from men who saw her father's townhouse and assumed financial security they could access through matrimony. None had shown the slightest interest in her thoughts, her dreams, or her determination to matter in the world beyond the domestic sphere. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I worry about your future, my dear," Professor Whitman said, accepting the cup of tea Eleanor prepared for him. "Boston society has little patience for women who think for themselves. When I'm gone, you'll need to find your own way, and I fear the path won't be easy." Eleanor poured her own tea, considering his words. She had been managing her father's correspondence, his finances, and increasingly his medical care for over a year. The responsibility had shown her capabilities she never knew she possessed, but it had also revealed the precarious nature of their situation. The consumption treatments were expensive. Dr. Henley's monthly visits, the special medicines, the modifications to the house for her father's comfort. All of it was steadily draining their resources. Eleanor had quietly sold some of her mother's jewelry and several pieces of furniture, but she knew these measures were merely delaying the inevitable financial crisis that would follow her father's death. "Perhaps I should consider Mrs. Patterson's suggestion about the teaching position at her girls' academy," Eleanor mused, stirring honey into her tea. "It wouldn't pay much, but it would provide respectability and independence." Professor Whitman frowned. "Teaching other people's daughters to be ornamental. Eleanor, you have the finest mind I've ever encountered, male or female. Don't bury it in a classroom full of girls who will never be allowed to use their education." But what alternatives existed? Eleanor had watched other unmarried women in their social circle become increasingly marginalized as they aged, dependent on the charity of relatives who grew less generous with each passing year. The prospect of becoming a poor relation, grateful for a corner room and permission to make herself useful, held no appeal whatsoever. 3 weeks later, Professor Whitman passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving Eleanor with memories of extraordinary intellectual companionship and debts that quickly proved insurmountable. The funeral was well attended. Marcus Whitman had been respected in academic circles, but respect didn't translate to financial assistance. Eleanor discovered that their lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, had been advancing money against the house's value for months to cover medical expenses. The townhouse would need to be sold, along with most of its contents, to satisfy the creditors. What remained wouldn't support Eleanor for more than a few months, and that only if she lived very modestly indeed. "Perhaps your cousins in Hartford would welcome you," Pemberton suggested delicately as they reviewed the sobering financial documents in his office. "Family obligations, you understand." Eleanor understood perfectly. The Hartford cousins had made their opinion of her father's unconventional child-rearing abundantly clear over the years. They would take her in, certainly, but only if she agreed to transform herself into the kind of docile, grateful dependent they could tolerate. Her education, her opinions, her very personality would need to be suppressed in favor of useful domesticity. The teaching position Mrs. Patterson had mentioned proved less appealing upon closer examination. The salary was barely enough to cover rent for a single room, and the Academy's philosophy emphasized producing accomplished ornaments rather than educated women. Eleanor would be expected to teach watercolor painting, simple French phrases, and enough literature to make conversation without developing dangerous ideas. It was while sorting through her father's papers, preparing to auction his extensive library, that Eleanor first encountered the matrimonial advertisements in the newspaper. She had been using old papers to wrap books when a particular notice caught her attention. "Western gentleman of means seeks refined Eastern lady for matrimony. Beautiful home in thriving community. Partnership in building something meaningful. Guaranteed. Only serious inquiries from ladies of good character and education. The advertisement was different from others she had noticed in passing. Most sought housekeepers who could also provide companionship, or mothers for existing children, or simply bodies to fill the shortage of women in frontier communities. This one used the word partnership and specifically requested education. Eleanor found herself studying the brief text, imagining what kind of man would compose such a notice. Someone established enough to own property, but progressive enough to value a woman's mind. Someone building a future rather than simply trying to fill an immediate need. On an impulse she couldn't fully explain, Eleanor drafted a careful response. She described her education, her experience managing her father's household, her desire for a life of purpose beyond the conventional expectations of Boston society. She was honest about her financial situation, while emphasizing her willingness to contribute meaningfully to a shared enterprise. The reply came faster than she had expected, written in a confident hand on quality paper that suggested genuine prosperity. Samuel Morrison introduced himself as the owner of Prosperity's largest general store, a member of the town council, and a widower seeking not just a wife, but a true companion for the adventure of building civilization in Kansas. His letter painted a vivid picture of opportunity. Prosperity was growing rapidly as farmers claimed land under the Homestead Act, and the railroad brought Eastern goods and Eastern people to the frontier. The town boasted a new schoolhouse, plans for a proper library, and families eager to establish cultural institutions that would make their community a beacon of civilization on the prairie. Samuel described his store as more than a business. It was the heart of community commerce, the place where farmers gathered to discuss crops and weather, where women selected fabrics for their families' clothing, where children pressed their noses against jars of penny candy. He painted himself as a man who understood the importance of books, of music, of the refinements that made life meaningful beyond mere survival. I believe a successful marriage is built on mutual respect and shared dreams, he wrote in his second letter. I'm not seeking a housekeeper, but a partner who can help shape our community's future. Prosperity needs a woman of education and refinement to establish the cultural foundations that will serve our children and grandchildren. The correspondence continued for months as Eleanor managed her father's declining health and mounting debts. Samuel's letters arrived weekly, each one revealing more of his character and ambitions. He described evenings reading by lamplight, Sunday concerts in the town square, plans for amateur theatrical productions that would bring entertainment to the growing population. He was building a proper house, he reported, with modern conveniences, including indoor plumbing and a kitchen designed for efficiency. The parlor would have built-in bookshelves for Eleanor's inherited library. The bedroom windows faced east to catch the morning light she loved for reading. He seemed to remember every detail she had shared about her preferences and habits. Most remarkably, Samuel appeared genuinely interested in Eleanor's thoughts and opinions. When she mentioned her father's work in natural sciences, Samuel wrote enthusiastically about the geological specimens he had collected and his amateur interest in the plant life of the prairie. When Eleanor described her frustration with society's limitations on women's intellectual pursuits, Samuel responded with stories of frontier women who had established schools, started newspapers, and built businesses alongside their husbands. The frontier offers opportunities for women that Eastern society would never permit, he assured her. Here, necessity creates equality. A woman's mind and determination are valued because they're essential for survival and progress. Eleanor found herself looking forward to Samuel's letters with growing excitement. Here was a man who seemed to appreciate exactly those qualities that made her unmarriageable in Boston. Her intelligence, her independence, her desire to contribute meaningfully to the world beyond domestic duties. The photograph Samuel sent showed a man of perhaps 35, with honest eyes and a confident bearing. He stood before what appeared to be a substantial building with Morrison's General Store, painted across the front. Well-dressed customers could be seen through the windows, and the sidewalk was busy with townspeople going about their business. Eleanor studied that photograph for hours, imagining herself stepping into that prosperous scene. She pictured herself organizing community events, perhaps starting a literary society or a lending library. Samuel had mentioned that several of Prosperity's leading families were eager for someone to coordinate cultural activities for their growing children. It would be everything she had dreamed of during those long nights caring for her father. A chance to use her education, to matter in a community, to build something lasting with a man who valued her mind as much as her companionship. When Samuel finally proposed marriage in his 8th letter, Eleanor accepted without hesitation. The alternative, becoming a dependent, relative or a poorly paid teacher of decorative accomplishments, seemed like a death sentence compared to the vibrant future Samuel described. "I will arrive in Prosperity on the 15th of April, she wrote in her acceptance letter. "I come not just as your bride, but as your partner in every sense of the word. Together, we will build something worthy of the opportunities this new land provides." Samuel's response radiated joy and anticipation. He would meet her at the station with a bouquet of prairie roses and the biggest smile in Kansas. The house was nearly finished, the community was eager to welcome her, and he could hardly contain his excitement about beginning their shared life. Eleanor used the proceeds from selling her father's books and furniture to purchase appropriate clothing for frontier life, practical dresses that could withstand the demands of an active woman. In a growing town, she packed her most treasured possessions, her mother's china, her father's medical instruments that might prove useful in a community without a doctor, and the volumes of poetry that had sustained her through difficult times. The journey west had been an adventure in itself. Eleanor watched the landscape change from familiar New England hills to vast prairies that stretched beyond the horizon. She struck up conversations with fellow passengers, learning about the opportunities and challenges that awaited newcomers to Kansas. A farmer named Johnson described the richness of prairie soil and the promise of abundant harvests. A merchant explained how the railroad was transforming isolated settlements into thriving towns almost overnight. A teacher bound for Dodge City spoke enthusiastically about the hunger for education she encountered everywhere on the frontier. Eleanor felt her excitement building with each mile that carried her further from Boston's constraints and closer to the unlimited possibilities Samuel had described. She rehearsed conversations they would have, imagined the projects they would undertake together, pictured herself taking her place as a respected member of Prosperity's leading families. Even the dust storm that overtook the train hadn't dampened her spirits initially. Eleanor had read about the dramatic weather of the Great Plains, and experiencing it firsthand seemed like an initiation into her new life. She watched the towering wall of dust with fascination rather than fear, seeing it as evidence of the raw power and endless horizons that would define her future. The storm had been magnificent, terrible, and strangely exhilarating. Eleanor had felt small but significant as the train battled through nature's fury, carrying her toward a destiny she had chosen rather than one imposed by circumstance or society's expectations. When the train emerged from the worst of the storm, and the conductor announced Prosperity Station, Eleanor's heart had raced with anticipation. In minutes, she would meet the man whose letters had convinced her to risk everything for love and partnership. She would see the thriving community that would become her new home, the store where she would help build a commercial empire, the house where they would create a family and a legacy. Instead, She found devastation beyond imagination and silence, where 847 lives should have been creating the bustle of a growing town. Now, standing alone in the ruins with Samuel's scattered roses in her hands, Eleanor understood that even the most careful plans, the most sincere promises, and the most desperate hopes could be destroyed by forces beyond human control or prediction. But she also understood something else. The same determination that had carried her through her father's illness, the same intelligence that had impressed Samuel Morrison, and the same courage that had brought her 1,000 miles from everything familiar, those qualities were still hers. The storm might have destroyed Prosperity, but it had not destroyed Eleanor Whitman. Whatever had happened here, whatever fate had befallen Samuel and the townspeople, Eleanor would find a way to survive. She had not come this far to be defeated. By circumstances, however catastrophic they might appear, the movement she had glimpsed in the distance was coming closer now, resolving into the shape of a man leading a pack mule through the devastation. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, clutched her carpetbag more firmly, and prepared to meet whatever came next, with the same determination that had carried her this far. Her story with Samuel Morrison might be over before it had truly begun. But Eleanor Whitman's story was far from finished. The figure approaching through the devastation moved with the careful gait of someone navigating treacherous terrain. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out more details. A tall man, perhaps 50 years of age, leading a heavily laden mule through the scattered debris. He wore the practical clothing of someone accustomed to hard work: canvas pants, leather, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Most striking was the black patch covering his left eye, secured with a leather strap that disappeared beneath his graying hair. Eleanor remained motionless, unsure whether this stranger represented salvation or additional danger. Her father had taught her to observe before acting, and she applied that lesson now, studying the man's movements and bearing for clues about his intentions. The stranger paused when he spotted her, his single eye taking in her appearance with obvious surprise. Eleanor realized what she must look like: a woman in traveling clothes designed for meeting a prospective husband, standing alone in the ruins of a dead town, with tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "Mom," the man called, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "Are you injured?" The simple question broke through Eleanor's paralysis. "No," she managed, her voice hoarse from the dust. "No, I'm not hurt, just lost." The stranger secured his mule to a partially buried hitching post and approached with deliberate slowness, clearly aware that his appearance might be alarming to a lone woman. As he drew nearer, Eleanor could see that despite the eye patch and weathered features, his expression held genuine concern rather than threat. "Name's Josiah Cumberland," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I was prospecting up in the hills when I saw the storm hit. Came down to see if anyone needed help." Eleanor studied his face, noting the deep lines etched by sun and wind, the careful way he held his head to compensate for his missing eye, and the calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor. There was something solid about him, a competence born of self-reliance that reminded her of her father's academic colleagues who had spent years conducting fieldwork in challenging conditions. "Eleanor Whitman," she replied, then corrected herself, with bitter irony. "Eleanor Morrison, I suppose, though it seems that name has little meaning now." Josiah's single eye sharpened with understanding. "Mail-order bride." The blunt question might have offended her in Boston, but here in the ruins of her carefully planned future, Eleanor found his directness oddly comforting. "Yes, I was to marry Samuel Morrison, the store owner. He was supposed to meet me at the station." Josiah glanced around the devastation, his expression growing grim. "I knew Sam Morrison, good man, honest in his dealings, had his store right over there." He pointed toward a massive sand dune that seemed to have swallowed an entire city block. Storm like this one, it moved a lot of earth in a hurry. The implication hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had been standing in a graveyard, searching for signs of life in what was essentially a mass burial site. The scattered roses in her hand suddenly felt unbearably heavy. "How many people lived here?" she whispered. "Close to 1,000. Last I heard, prosperity was growing fast." Josiah's voice was gentle but honest. "If they didn't evacuate in time." Eleanor sank down onto a partially buried wooden crate, the full scope of the disaster finally penetrating her shock. 1,000 people, families who had come west seeking opportunity, children who had played in streets now buried under tons of earth, women who had planned community events that would never happen. Samuel Morrison, who had written letters full of hope and love, to a woman he would never meet. The storm came up sudden, Josiah continued, settling onto his haunches nearby. Even experienced plainsmen got caught off guard. Wind like you wouldn't believe, moving walls of dirt thick as molasses. Some folks might have made it to storm cellars, but... He didn't finish the thought, but Eleanor understood. Even those who had found shelter would have faced a terrible choice: stay buried and suffocate, or dig out and face the ongoing devastation. And how long could anyone survive underground without air, water, or food? "I have nowhere to go," Eleanor said, speaking the words aloud for the first time. "I spent my last money on the train ticket. Everything I owned is either in those trunks at the station or was buried with Samuel's store." She looked up at Josiah, desperation creeping into her voice. "What am I supposed to do?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment, studying her with his single eye. Eleanor could see him weighing something, making calculations she couldn't fathom. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "Lady like you, educated and all, you've got options. Train comes through twice a week, heading both directions. You could wire the family back east, ask them to send travel money." Eleanor almost laughed at the bitter irony. "My family made their feelings about my Western adventure quite clear. They'll be happy to say they told me so, but they won't be sending money to rescue me from my own poor judgment." Friends, then. The kind of friends who could afford to help a stranded woman were also the kind who disapproved of mail-order marriages in the first place. Eleanor stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps through the sand. "I burned my bridges in Boston, Mr. Cumberland. I sold everything, gave up my position, said goodbye to everyone who mattered. I came here because I thought I could build something better than the life society had planned for me." She gestured toward the ruins around them. "Instead, I find that sometimes the things we build can be destroyed in a single afternoon, leaving us with less than nothing." Josiah nodded slowly. "Frontiers got a way of stripping things down to what really matters. Question is, what do you find when everything else gets blown away?" Eleanor considered his words, thinking about what remained after the storm had taken everything else. Her education was still intact. No dust storm could bury the knowledge her father had given her. Her determination had brought her this far and could carry her further. Her willingness to work hard and contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself hadn't been damaged by the devastation. "I find that I'm still the same woman who left Boston," she said finally. "Still willing to work for what I want. Still refusing to accept limitations others try to place on me. The circumstances have changed, but I haven't." Something shifted in Josiah's expression, a glimmer of what might have been approval. "That's a good start," he said. "Now, the practical question is what you're going to do with those qualities while you figure out your next move." Eleanor looked around the ruins, trying to imagine any possibility for survival in this wasteland. "Is there anything left? Any A place where someone could... She trailed off, realizing how impossible it sounded. Not here, Josiah said firmly, but I know these parts pretty well. There's other settlements, some that might have weathered the storm better. Places that need school teachers, or women who can help with medical care, or folks who can read and write for those who can't. How far? Eleanor asked, hope flickering despite herself. Depends on where we're talking about. Some are a day's ride, some are farther. But the question is whether you're prepared for the kind of travel it would take to get there. Josiah's eye travelled over her travelling dress, clearly unsuited for rough country, and whether you're prepared for the kind of life you'd find when you got there. Eleanor thought about the alternatives. She could try to flag down the next train, attempt to convince the conductor to let her ride without paying, and arrive wherever it stopped as a penniless refugee dependent on charity. She could stay here in the ruins, hoping against hope that rescue would come from some unexpected quarter, or she could trust this one-eyed stranger who seemed to understand both the dangers and the possibilities of frontier life. What kind of life? She asked. Josiah stood up, brushing dust from his hands. Hard work, long days, no guarantees about anything. You'd be earning your keep in places where folks don't have time for social niceties. You'd be sleeping on floors, eating beans and hardtack, dealing with people who might not appreciate your education or your opinions about how things should be done. He paused, studying her reaction. On the other hand, you'd be making your own decisions about your future instead of depending on someone else's charity. You'd be proving what you're worth instead of hoping someone will take care of you. Eleanor felt something stir inside her, the same determination that had sustained her through her father's illness and the financial crisis that followed. The life Josiah described sounded difficult, but it also sounded honest. No false promises, no romantic dreams, just the opportunity to earn her place through her own efforts. "Where would you suggest I start?" she asked. Josiah looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to respond so directly. "There's a mining camp about 2 days' ride from here. Silver Strike brought in a lot of men, but they're short on women who can cook, clean, tend wounds, that sort of thing. Pays not much, but it's honest work, and it would give you time to plan your next step." A mining camp? Eleanor tried to imagine herself in such a place, serving meals to rough men who spent their days underground. It wasn't exactly the cultured community life Samuel Morrison had promised, but it was survival, and survival was the first step toward building anything else. "It's not what you're used to," Josiah admitted. "But the men there are mostly decent. Folks trying to make their stake. They'd respect a woman who pulled her weight and didn't give them any trouble. And there's talk of the camp growing into a permanent settlement if the silver holds out." Eleanor thought about her father's advice. Observe the situation, consider the options, make the best decision possible with available information. The mining camp represented a chance to earn money, establish her independence, and evaluate other possibilities from a position of relative stability rather than desperate need. "How would I get there?" she asked. "I assume walking 2 days through, and country I don't know, isn't advisable for a woman alone." "It's not advisable for anyone alone," Josiah corrected. "Country out here can be treacherous, especially after a storm like this one. Landmarks get moved around, water sources get buried or contaminated, and there's always the possibility of running into folks who aren't as helpful as they might appear." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "I was heading back up to my claim anyway," Josiah continued slowly. "Takes me past the mining camp. If you're serious about this, and if you can handle rough travel, I suppose I could see you get there safely." The offer hung in the air between them. Eleanor understood the implications of accepting help from a strange man, traveling alone with him through an isolated country. In Boston, such a suggestion would have been scandalous beyond consideration, but Boston's rules seemed increasingly irrelevant in this transformed landscape. "Why would you help me?" she asked, needing to understand his motivations before making such a momentous decision. Josiah was quiet for a moment, his single eye focused on something in the distance. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. Been in desperate straits myself once or twice. Had folks help me when they didn't have to, probably saved my life more than once. Figured I'd pass it along when I got the chance. He looked directly at her. Also, you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who had more courage than good, sense, and who deserved better than what life handed her. Eleanor heard the pain in his voice and realized that Josiah Cumberland carried his own story of loss and disappointment. The knowledge created an unexpected bond between them. Two people who had learned that life rarely matched its promises, but who kept moving forward anyway. "If I go with you," Eleanor said carefully, "what would you expect in return?" "Nothing. Improper, if that's what you're worried about," Josiah replied firmly. "You'd carry your own weight on the trail, help with camp duties, and follow my lead when it comes to staying safe. That's all." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his directness. "And when we reach the mining camp?" "That's your business. I'll introduce you to the folks who run things, put in a good word if they'll listen to it. After that, you're on your own." The sun was setting now, painting the devastated landscape in shades of orange and red that made the destruction look almost beautiful. Eleanor realized that she needed to make her decision soon. Camping in the ruins overnight would be both dangerous and pointless. She thought about the woman who had left Boston full of hope and romantic dreams. That woman had believed in promises, in carefully laid plans, in the possibility of finding happiness through someone else's vision of the future. That woman was buried as thoroughly as prosperity itself. But Eleanor Whitman, not Morrison, she realized, but Whitman, carrying her father's name and his legacy of intellectual courage, Eleanor Whitman was still standing. Older, perhaps, wiser, certainly more aware of how quickly circumstances could change, but fundamentally unchanged in her determination to create a meaningful life on her own terms. "Mr. Cumberland," she said, extending her hand to shake his in the manner of business partners rather than social acquaintances, "I accept your offer. When do we leave?" Josiah clasped her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her gloved fingers. "Dawn. We'll want to make good time while the weather holds." As they shook hands in the ruins of Prosperity, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The desperate mail-order bride was gone, replaced by a woman prepared to face whatever came next with her eyes wide open and her expectations grounded in reality rather than romance. The storm had destroyed her carefully planned future, but it had also blown away the last of her illusions about depending on others for her happiness. What emerged from the wreckage was someone stronger, more self-reliant, and infinitely more prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. Eleanor Whitman was about to begin a new journey, one that would test every lesson her father had taught her. About courage, intelligence, and the power of the human spirit to adapt and overcome. This time, however, she would be traveling toward a destination of her own choosing, with a guide who offered honesty instead of promises and hard work instead of false hopes. It wasn't the future she had planned, but as she stood in the ruins of someone else's dream, Eleanor realized it might be exactly the future she needed. Dawn broke grey and threatening over the ruins of Prosperity, with an ominous wind stirring the settled dust into spiraling columns that danced across the devastated landscape. Eleanor had spent the night in what remained of the train station's waiting room, huddled beneath a canvas tarp Josiah had provided, listening to the eerie sounds of debris shifting in the wind, and the distant howl of coyotes drawn by scents she preferred not to contemplate. Josiah appeared at first light, leading his pack mule and a saddled horse Eleanor hadn't seen the previous evening. The animal was a sturdy mare, perhaps 15 hands high, with the patient demeanor of a creature accustomed to difficult terrain and long journeys. "Her name's Patience," Josiah said, stroking the mare's neck. "Belongs to Sam Morrison. Found her in what's left of his stable, scared but unharmed. Figure she needs somewhere to go as much as you do." Eleanor stared at the horse, struck by the bitter irony that Samuel's mare might be the only thing of value that had survived the storm. The animal's survival seemed almost miraculous, yet it also represented another connection to the man she would never meet, the life she would never live. "Can you ride?" Josiah asked, noting her hesitation. "Yes," Eleanor replied, though it had been years since she had been on horseback. "My father believed physical education was as important as intellectual development. I learned to ride in Boston Common." Josiah's single eye held a hint of amusement. "Boston Common's probably a bit different from what we'll be crossing, but if you can stay in the saddle, Patience will do most of the work." As Eleanor approached the mare, the animal nickered softly and allowed her to stroke the velvety nose. There was something comforting about the horse's warm presence, a reminder that life persisted even in the midst of destruction. "We need to move," Josiah said, checking the straps on his pack mule. "Weather's building again, and I want to be well clear of this area before it hits." Eleanor looked toward the eastern horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather. The thought of another storm filled her with dread, but she also understood Josiah's urgency. The ruins of Prosperity offered no real shelter, and being caught in the open during severe weather could prove fatal. They had traveled perhaps 5 miles from the devastated town when Eleanor first noticed the riders. 3 men on horseback, moving parallel to their course, but staying just far enough away to avoid easy identification. Josiah spotted them at almost the same moment, his head turning sharply toward the distant figures. "Friends of yours?" Eleanor asked, though something in Josiah's posture told her the answer. "Don't think so," Josiah replied grimly. "Been following us since we left town. Could be coincidence, but I've learned not to believe much in coincidence." Eleanor shaded her eyes against the morning glare, trying to make out details of the pursuing riders. They were too far away to distinguish faces or clothing, but their persistence suggested purpose rather than casual travel. "What do they want?" she asked, fighting down a flutter of panic. "Could be several things," Josiah said, urging his mule to a faster pace. "Sometimes folks see a woman traveling with one man and get ideas about easy pickings. Sometimes they're looking for particular people for particular reasons." The implication sent ice through Eleanor's veins. "You think they're after me specifically?" "Might be. Pretty woman with Eastern manners, traveling alone after a disaster? Could someone figured you're worth more than just the clothes on your back?" Eleanor thought about the trunks she had left at the station, containing the last remnants of her father's estate. Anyone who had witnessed her arrival might assume she carried significant resources. The irony was bitter. She was being pursued for wealth she didn't possess. "What do we do?" she asked, grateful that Josiah seemed to take their situation seriously rather than dismissing her concerns. "We keep moving and stay alert. If they're just curious, they'll lose interest eventually. If they're planning something, we'll know soon enough." For the next hour, they maintained a steady pace across increasingly rough terrain. The landscape was marked by deep arroyos, scattered rock formations, and patches of prairie grass that provided minimal cover. Behind them, the 3 riders continued their parallel course, sometimes disappearing behind hills, only to reappear moments later. Eleanor found herself grateful for her riding lessons in Boston, though Patience's steady gait made the journey easier than she had expected. The mare seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, picking her way carefully through obstacles while maintaining their speed. "There," Josiah said suddenly, pointing toward a rocky outcropping ahead. "We'll take shelter there and see." What they do, The formation offered a natural fortress, with boulders large enough to provide cover and multiple escape routes if needed. Josiah led them into a narrow canyon between the rocks, where they could rest their animals while maintaining a view of the approaching riders. "Now we find out what they really want," Josiah said, checking his rifle and positioning himself behind a boulder that commanded the canyon entrance. Eleanor dismounted on shaking legs, her body stiff from the unfamiliar exercise. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. She was hiding in rocks in the middle of nowhere, possibly being hunted by men with unknown intentions, dependent entirely on a one-eyed stranger for protection. The riders appeared at the canyon mouth within minutes, confirming that they had indeed been following deliberately. Eleanor got her first clear look at them. 3 men in their 30s or 40s, wearing the rough clothing of cowboys or drifters. They were armed with pistols and rifles, and their faces held the hard expressions of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Hello there," called the leader, a tall man with a black beard and cold eyes. "We're looking for a woman who might have gotten separated from her people. Pretty lady from back east, probably confused and scared." Josiah remained silent, his rifle ready but not yet aimed directly at the men. "We're here to help," the bearded man continued, his voice carrying false concern. "Dangerous country for a lady traveling alone. We can escort her to safety, make sure she gets proper care." Eleanor felt sick as she recognized the calculated nature of their approach. These men had indeed been watching, had seen her arrival and her obvious distress, and had concluded she would make an easy target. "Ma'am," called another of the riders, "we know you're in there. No need to be afraid. We just want to make sure you're all right." The concern in his voice was as false as his companions', but Eleanor could hear the underlying threat. They weren't going to simply ride away if ignored. Josiah finally spoke, his voice carrying across the canyon with deadly calm. "Lady's fine, boys. She's under my protection, and we don't need any help." "That's so." The bearded leader's mask of concern dropped immediately. "Funny thing, though, we heard there was a reward posted for a particular woman. Someone back in Prosperity was real worried about her welfare." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. The implication was clear. Someone had indeed been looking for her specifically, someone who knew enough about her arrival to post a reward. But who? And why? Reward from who? Josiah called back, though Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Fellow named Morrison," said his bride-to-be got confused in all the excitement after the storm. "He's real anxious to get her back safe." And sound, the lie was breathtaking in its audacity. Eleanor knew Samuel Morrison was buried beneath tons of earth, yet these men were claiming he had sent them to find her. The fabrication suggested they had been in Prosperity after the storm, had perhaps searched through records or spoken to survivors to learn about her expected arrival. "Morrison's dead," Josiah replied flatly, "along with most everyone else in that town, so either you're mistaken about who sent you, or you're lying." The silence that followed was heavy with menace. Eleanor could see the 3 men exchanging glances, clearly debating their next move. The pretense of rescue was over. Now they had to decide whether to press their claim through force. "Well now," said the bearded leader finally, "seems like there might be some confusion here. Why don't the lady come out and we'll sort this all out peaceful-like?" "I don't think so," Josiah replied. "I think you boys better move along before this gets unpleasant for everyone." One of the other riders laughed harshly. "3 of us, 1 of you, plus we got all day to wait you out. That water you're carrying won't last forever." Eleanor realized they were trapped. The men could indeed wait them out, and while the rocky formation provided excellent defensive cover, it was also a prison if their pursuers were determined enough. "What do you really want?" she called out, deciding that directness might serve better than continued deception. "Well now, that's more like it," the leader replied. "Smart lady, willing to be reasonable. "We heard you might be carrying some valuable items, maybe some money from your family back east. We're thinking a smart woman like you would rather part with material goods than face unpleasantness." There it was, simple robbery dressed up as rescue. Eleanor felt a flash of anger alongside her fear. These men had preyed on the disaster at Prosperity, using the chaos and destruction to target vulnerable survivors. "I don't have any money," she called back truthfully. "I spent everything I had getting here." "Now that's hard to believe," another rider interjected. "Pretty lady like you, traveling all this way to get married? Must have brought a dowry, maybe some family jewelry." Eleanor thought about her mother's simple wedding ring, her father's pocket watch, the few small items of value she had managed to keep. Even if she surrendered everything, would it satisfy them? Or would they decide she was worth more than her possessions? Josiah must have been thinking along similar lines. "They're not going to be satisfied with whatever you might give them," he said quietly. "Men like this, they see a woman alone. They get ideas that go beyond simple theft." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with understanding. She had been naive. To think that robbery was the worst thing these men might have in mind. "So what do we do?" she whispered. "We get out of here," Josiah replied grimly. "There's a passage at the back of this canyon, leads up to higher ground. If we can reach it, without them seeing, we might be able to lose them in the rocks." Eleanor looked toward the narrow cleft Josiah indicated, barely visible in the canyon's rear wall. It looked treacherous, possibly impassable for the animals, but it was better than remaining trapped. "What about the horses?" she asked. "We take what we can carry and go on foot. Horses would just slow us down on the kind of terrain we'll be crossing." The thought of abandoning Patience, Samuel's mare who had survived the storm, caused Eleanor unexpected grief. But survival took precedence over sentiment. "Give me 5 minutes to get ready," she said, moving toward her meager belongings. As Eleanor gathered the essentials, water, what little food they had, her father's medical instruments, which might prove valuable, she heard the conversation continuing outside. "Patience is a virtue, boys," the bearded leader was saying, "but it's not unlimited. Lady's got until sundown to be reasonable. After that, we come in after her." Eleanor shivered at the casual menace in his voice. These men had clearly done this before, had perfected their approach to terrorizing isolated travelers. The storm that had destroyed Prosperity had also created ideal hunting grounds for predators like these. Josiah appeared beside her, his own pack ready. "Time to go," he said quietly. "Stay close, move quiet, and do exactly what I tell you." As they crept toward the rear of the canyon, Eleanor felt the weight of another life-changing decision. Once again, she was fleeing into unknown territory, dependent on a near stranger for protection, facing dangers she had never imagined when she left Boston. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't running toward romantic dreams or false promises. She was running toward survival, toward the chance to prove that Eleanor Whitman could face whatever challenges the frontier offered and emerge stronger. The passage was even narrower than it had appeared, barely wide enough for one person at a time. Eleanor followed Josiah into the darkness, her hands scraped raw by the rough stone walls, her traveling dress torn by unseen obstacles. Behind them, she could hear the voices of their pursuers growing more impatient. They climbed in silence for what felt like hours, following passages that seemed to lead deeper into the earth rather than up to escape. Eleanor's legs burned with the effort. Her lungs struggled with the thin air, but she forced herself to keep moving. Stopping meant capture, and capture meant facing consequences she refused to contemplate. Finally, they emerged onto a high plateau that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding country. Far below, Eleanor could see the 3 riders still positioned at the canyon entrance, apparently unaware that their quarry had escaped. "Now what?" Eleanor asked, collapsing onto a boulder. "To catch her breath." "Now we disappear," Josiah replied, studying the landscape with his experienced eye. "They'll figure out eventually that we're gone, but by then we'll be long gone ourselves." Eleanor looked around the desolate plateau, seeing nothing but rocks and sparse vegetation stretching to the horizon. "Where exactly are we going to disappear?" "To?" Josiah pointed toward a distant line of hills. "My claim's up that way. It's not much, but it's hidden, defensible, and supplied for a long stay. We can hole up there until those boys give up and move on to easier pickings." The prospect of reaching safety was enormously appealing, but Eleanor also understood that accepting Josiah's protection placed her even more completely in his debt. She was learning that survival on the frontier often meant choosing between different forms of dependence. "And after that," she asked, "after that, we stick to the original plan. I'll get you to the mining camp, introduce you around, and you start building whatever kind of life you want to build." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his straightforward approach. No false promises, no romantic complications, just practical assistance. From one survivor to another, as they prepared to descend from the plateau and continue their journey, Eleanor took one last look back toward the canyon, where three men continued their futile wait. She had escaped their immediate threat, but she knew the frontier held many other dangers for a woman traveling alone. The mail-order bride who had arrived in prosperity was truly gone now, replaced by someone harder, more cautious, but also more determined. Eleanor Whitman was learning that survival required not just courage, but cunning, not just hope, but realistic assessment of threats and opportunities. The journey to Josiah's hidden claim would be the next test of her evolving character, another step in her transformation from dependent woman to self-reliant survivor. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with eyes wide open and illusions finally stripped away. The pursuit was over for now, but Eleanor's real education in frontier survival was just beginning. The journey to Josiah's claim took them through terrain that seemed designed to test human endurance. They traveled mostly at night, navigating by starlight through canyons that twisted like serpents and across mesas that offered no protection from the wind. During the day, they sheltered in whatever shade they could find, rationing water and speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Eleanor's traveling dress, already damaged from their escape through the narrow passage, became increasingly tattered. As they climbed over rocks and pushed through thorny scrub, her hands were scratched and bleeding, her face sunburned despite the protection of her bonnet, and every muscle in her body ached from the constant physical demands of their flight. But something remarkable was happening to her spirit. With each mile they covered, each obstacle they overcame, Eleanor felt herself growing stronger, not just physically, but mentally. The desperate woman who had stood weeping in the ruins of prosperity was being replaced by someone harder, more resourceful, more confident in her ability to survive whatever challenges the frontier might present. On the third night of their journey, as they climbed a steep trail barely visible in the moonlight, Josiah suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. Eleanor froze, her heart racing as she listened for whatever had alarmed him. "The secret," Martha explained as she poured coffee from a battered pot, "is learning to bend without breaking. The frontier changes fast, and the folks who survive are the ones who can change with it." Eleanor found herself drawn to Martha's pragmatic wisdom. Here was a woman who had faced devastating loss, yet had refused to be defeated by it. She had adapted to circumstances that would have crushed someone less resilient, creating a new life from the wreckage of her old one. "How did you learn to prospect on your own?" Eleanor asked. "Surely it's dangerous work for a woman alone." Martha smiled grimly. "Everything out here is dangerous for a woman alone. But I had 3 choices after Henry died. Go back east and be a burden on relatives who never liked me anyway, marry some man who just wanted a housekeeper, or figure out how to take care of myself. The last option seemed the most appealing. Jake Morrison, a grizzled man in his 50s, nodded approvingly. Martha knows more about reading rock formations than most men twice her age. She's pulled more silver out of played-out claims than the original owners ever did. Eleanor felt a spark of recognition. Here were people who had refused to accept limitations others tried to impose on them, who had created their own definitions of success and respectability. They represented a different model of frontier life than the one Samuel Morrison had described in his letters. Harder, more uncertain, but also more genuinely independent. The railroad proposition, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Would I be betraying you if I considered it? Not if you use the position to help rather than harm, Martha replied. Truth is, most of us are going to lose our claims whether you negotiate or not. Question is whether we get fair compensation or just get pushed off with nothing. Tom Chen, a quiet man with intelligent eyes, spoke up for the first time. My family came from China to work the railroads. I know how these companies operate. They respect people who can talk business in their language, who understand contracts and legal procedures. You could be valuable to them, and that makes you valuable to us. Eleanor studied the faces around the fire, seeing hope and calculation in equal measure. These people weren't asking her to sacrifice herself for their benefit, but to use her. Advantages in ways that might help everyone involved. What exactly would you want me to negotiate? She asked. Fair market value for our claims, Martha said promptly, plus reasonable time to remove equipment and personal property, maybe assistance, finding new locations for those who want to continue mining. Billy Oakes, the youngest of the group, added his own concern, and protection from the criminal gangs that are using railroad construction as cover for their operations. Companies got security forces. They could extend that protection to displaced miners if they were asked properly. Eleanor realized she was being offered more than just a business opportunity. She was being invited to join a community of survivors, people who had learned to support each other in the face of forces beyond their individual control. It was different from the romantic partnership Samuel Morrison had promised, but it might be more real and lasting. If I agree to try this, she said slowly, what happens afterward, assuming I'm successful in negotiating with the railroad? That depends on what you want, Martha replied. Railroad work pays well, and there's always demand for people who can handle the legal and administrative side of operations. You could travel with the construction crews, helping to resolve disputes and manage relations with local communities. Or, Jake added, you could use the money you earn to establish yourself somewhere more permanently. Buy property, start a business, create the kind of life you want, instead of depending on what someone else offers you. The possibilities were intriguing, but Eleanor also recognized the risks. Working for the railroad would mean constant travel, exposure to rough conditions, and the moral complexity of representing interests that often conflicted with those of ordinary settlers. I need to see the railroad camp, she said finally, meet with their representatives and understand exactly what they're offering before I make any commitments. Fair enough, Martha agreed. But remember, they're more likely to take you seriously if you approach them as a representative of the displaced miners rather than just another woman looking for work. Josiah, who had been quietly listening to the entire conversation, finally spoke. You sure about this, Eleanor? Once you get involved? With the railroad, there's no telling where it might lead. Eleanor looked at him gratefully. Despite everything he had done to help her, he was still concerned about her welfare rather than trying to influence her decision for his own benefit. I'm not sure about anything, she admitted, but I'm learning that uncertainty might be the most honest condition on the frontier. At least this option lets me try to shape my own future instead of just hoping someone else will take care of me. Martha stood up, brushing coffee grounds from her cup. Railroad camp's about a day's ride. North of here. I can take you there tomorrow if you're ready to move fast. The longer we wait, the less leverage we'll have in any negotiations." Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied major decisions, but she also felt something else, a growing confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The terrified mail-order bride was truly gone now, replaced by someone who could evaluate opportunities and risks with clear eyes. "I'll go," she said, "but I want to understand exactly what authority I'll have to speak for the displaced miners. I won't make promises I can't keep or agreements that aren't in everyone's best interests." "That's all we can ask," Martha replied. "The frontier's got room for people who can be trusted to keep their word." As the group settled down for the night, Eleanor found herself lying awake under the star-filled sky, contemplating the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had come west, seeking a conventional marriage and domestic security. Instead, she was preparing to negotiate with railroad executives on behalf of displaced miners, using skills she had developed through necessity rather than training. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father had educated her to think independently and speak persuasively, but Boston society had offered no opportunities to use those abilities meaningfully. Now, in the harsh democracy of the frontier, her education might finally serve a purpose. Beyond mere ornamentation, Josiah's voice came quietly from his bedroll nearby. "You don't have to do this, you know. There are other options, safer ones." Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "I know, but I'm discovering that safety isn't as important to me as I thought it was. What matters is having the chance to matter, to use whatever abilities I have in ways that make a difference. Just remember," Josiah said, "the railroad's not in business to help miners or anyone else. They'll use you as long as you're useful, then discard you when you're not." "I'll remember," Eleanor promised, "but I'll also remember that I'm not the same woman who stepped off the train in Prosperity. I've learned a few things about protecting my own interests." The conversation ended there, but Eleanor's thoughts continued racing. Tomorrow would bring another test of her evolving character, another opportunity to prove that she could thrive in circumstances that would have terrified her just weeks earlier. The unexpected salvation Martha Hendricks offered wasn't rescue in any conventional sense. It was something better, the chance to rescue herself through her own efforts, to build something meaningful from the ruins of her original plans. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Eleanor felt a sense of anticipation, rather than dread about the challenges ahead. She was no longer running from a failed future, but moving toward possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. The frontier was teaching her that salvation often came in forms she hadn't expected, from people she hadn't planned to meet in circumstances she couldn't have predicted. But it was still salvation, still the chance to create a life worth living on her own terms. Tomorrow, she would begin learning whether she could negotiate that salvation not just for herself, but for others who had also seen their dreams buried beneath forces beyond their control. He whispered, pointing toward a distant, flickering light. "That's not supposed to be there." Eleanor peered into the darkness, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The light appeared to be coming from the direction of Josiah's claim, a steady glow that suggested a campfire or lantern rather than natural phenomena. "Someone's at your mine?" she asked quietly. "Looks that way." Josiah's voice was grim. "Question is whether they're friends, claimed jumpers, or those boys who were chasing us." The possibility that their pursuers had somehow discovered Josiah's location and arrived ahead of them sent ice through Eleanor's veins. After days of grueling travel, the prospect of walking into a trap was almost unbearable. "What do we do?" she asked. "We get closer and see what we're dealing with," Josiah replied. "Stay low, stay quiet, and be ready to run if I give the word." They spent the next hour creeping through the rocks above Josiah's claim, using every bit of available cover to approach without being detected. As they drew nearer, Eleanor could make out more details of the scene below. Josiah's mining operation was more substantial than she had expected. A rough cabin sat beside a stream, with various pieces of equipment scattered around a cleared area. The mine entrance was visible as a dark opening in the hillside, reinforced with timber supports. Someone had clearly invested considerable time and effort in establishing this claim. 3 figures sat around a campfire near the cabin, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized them. Their pursuers had indeed found Josiah's refuge. "Persistent devils," Josiah muttered under his breath. "Must have tracked us better than I thought." But as they watched, Eleanor noticed something odd about the scene below. The 3 men seemed relaxed, almost casual in their posture. They were talking in normal voices, laughing occasionally, showing none of the alertness she would have expected from hunters waiting to ambush their prey. "Listen," she whispered to Josiah. They strained their ears to catch fragments of conversation drifting up from the camp below. What they heard made no sense in the context of pursuit or ambush. "Told you this claim was played out," one voice was saying. "Haven't seen color in a month." "Cumberland's too stubborn to admit it," another replied. "Man could be sitting on bare rock and still think he's gonna strike it rich." Eleanor felt Josiah stiffen beside her. These weren't their pursuers at all, but apparently miners who knew about his claim. The implications were troubling. Claim jumping was a serious offense in mining country, often settled with violence rather than legal proceedings. "Friends of yours?" Eleanor whispered. "Not exactly," Josiah replied grimly. "More like competitors, who've been waiting for a chance to move in on my territory." As they continued watching, a 4th figure emerged from the cabin, a woman with graying hair and practical clothing who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to frontier life. She carried a rifle with casual competence, scanning the surrounding darkness with the alertness of an experienced sentinel. "Martha Hendricks," Josiah said with surprise. "What's she doing here?" "Who is she?" Eleanor asked. "Widow woman. From over near Silver Creek. Lost her husband to a mine cave-in last year. She's been working on her own since then, making a decent living at it too." Josiah paused, studying the scene below. "But she's got no business being on my property." Eleanor watched Martha Hendricks as she completed her circuit of the camp, noting the woman's obvious competence and the respect the 3 men showed her. This wasn't a random group of claim jumpers, but an organized operation with clear leadership. "Maybe we should announce ourselves," Eleanor suggested. "Find out what they want before assuming the worst." Josiah considered this, clearly torn between caution and curiosity. Finally, he nodded. "Might as well. If they meant harm, they'd have posted guards. And Martha's got a reputation for being straight in her dealings." They made their way down the hillside openly, making enough noise to alert the camp to their approach without seeming threatening. Martha Hendricks spotted them first, raising her rifle but not aiming it directly at them. "That you, Cumberland?" she called out. "We've been waiting for you." "So I see," Josiah replied as they entered the circle of firelight. "Mind telling me why you're waiting on my claim instead of your own?" Martha studied Eleanor with obvious curiosity before answering. "Because your claim's in danger and mine's already gone. Thought you might want to know about it before you walked into trouble." Eleanor felt a chill of premonition. After everything they had endured to reach this refuge, the possibility that it too might be threatened was almost overwhelming. "What kind of trouble?" Josiah asked, settling onto a log near the fire and gesturing for Eleanor to do the same. "The kind that comes with railroad surveys and federal land grants," Martha replied grimly. "Governments decided this whole area would make a fine route for the transcontinental line. They're claiming eminent domain, buying out existing claims for pennies on the dollar, and using federal marshals to enforce their decisions. Eleanor watched Josiah's face as he absorbed this information. She could see the years of work and hope being destroyed by forces beyond his control, just as her own plans had been buried beneath the dust storm. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. "Survey crews supposed to be here within the week," one of the men answered. "After that, maybe a month before they start clearing the right-of-way." Eleanor felt the bitter irony of their situation. They had fled pursuers and endured days of hardship to reach a sanctuary that was already doomed. The frontier that had seemed to offer unlimited possibilities was proving to be as constrained by powerful interests as Boston society had been. "There's more," Martha continued. "Those 3 men who were asking around about a missing woman. They're not working alone. Word is they're part of a larger operation that's been preying on folks displaced by the storm, using the chaos to rob, kidnap, and worse." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The men who had pursued them were part of an organized criminal enterprise, which explained their confidence and persistence. It also meant that even if they had evaded immediate capture, the threat hadn't disappeared. "They know about this place?" Josiah asked. "They were asking questions in Silver Creek yesterday," Martha replied. "Someone might have mentioned your claim, though I doubt anyone told them exactly how to find it." Eleanor looked around the group, seeing her own exhaustion and uncertainty reflected in their faces. These were people who had come west, seeking opportunity and independence, only to discover that powerful forces could still control their destinies. The railroad, the federal government, and criminal organizations all represented threats to the autonomy they had hoped to find on the frontier. "So what do we do?" she asked, surprising herself by including herself in the group decision. Martha studied her with sharp eyes. "You're the woman they were looking for." Eleanor nodded. "Eleanor Whitman. I was supposed to marry Samuel Morrison in Prosperity before the storm destroyed everything." "Heard about Prosperity," Martha said sympathetically. "Terrible thing, but you might have more options than the rest of us." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "Well, you're educated. That's obvious from the way you speak. You've got Eastern connections, probably family with influence. The railroad might be willing to negotiate with someone like you, especially if you can make it worth their while." Eleanor almost laughed at the irony. "I'm afraid you overestimate my resources and connections. I came west because I had neither money nor family influence left in Boston." "But you've got something else," Martha continued. "You've got the look of someone who can talk to educated men, convince them that cooperation serves their interests better than force." One of the men leaned forward. "Martha's got a point. Railroad men are businessmen first. They want to complete their route with minimum fuss and maximum profit. Someone who could negotiate fair compensation for displaced miners might find herself in a position to benefit from the arrangement." Eleanor considered this unexpected possibility. The idea of working with the railroad rather than being victimized by it had never occurred to her, but it made a certain amount of sense. Her education and manner of speaking would indeed allow her to communicate with railroad executives in ways that rough miners could not. "What would be in it for me?" she asked, feeling slightly guilty for thinking in such calculating terms. "Commission on any settlements you negotiate," Martha replied promptly, "plus the railroad's protection from other threats while you're working for them. Men like those who are chasing you tend to avoid people who have powerful friends." The proposal was appealing in its practicality, but Eleanor also recognized its moral complexity. Working for the railroad would mean helping to displace people, like Josiah and Martha, even if she negotiated better terms for them. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "Don't think too long," Martha warned. "Survey crew arrives in a few days, and after that, the opportunity might disappear." As the evening wore on, Eleanor listened to the miners share their stories of displacement and adaptation. Each had faced losses similar to her own, dreams destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, plans derailed by forces they couldn't predict or resist. Yet each had also found ways to survive, to rebuild, to continue pursuing some version of their original goals. Martha Hendricks had lost her husband and their first claim, but had used her knowledge of mining to establish herself as an independent prospector. The three men with her, Jake Morrison, Tom Chen, and Billy Oakes, had all lost claims to various disasters but had formed a partnership that allowed them to pool resources and share risks. The railroad construction camp sprawled across a natural valley like a temporary city, complete with dormitories, supply warehouses, a medical tent, and administrative buildings that housed the engineering and legal departments. Eleanor had never seen anything like it. Hundreds of men working with coordinated precision to carve a path through the wilderness, using machinery and techniques that represented the cutting edge of industrial progress. Martha Hendricks had delivered her to the camp's perimeter as promised, then departed with a firm handshake and words that had stayed with Eleanor throughout her first nervous night in railroad company quarters. "Remember, you're not asking for charity. You're offering them something they need. Act like it." Now, dressed in the best approximation of business attire she could manage with her limited wardrobe, Eleanor sat in the camp's administrative office, waiting to meet with Chief Engineer Harrison Walsh and Legal Administrator Cornelius Blackwood. Through the thin walls, she could hear the constant noise of construction, hammering, shouting, the whistle of steam engines, and the rumble of heavy equipment being moved into position. The door opened, and two men entered who immediately commanded the space through their bearing and confidence. Walsh was perhaps 45, with the sun-weathered look of someone who spent his days outdoors, solving practical problems. Blackwood was younger, impeccably dressed despite the frontier, setting with the sharp eyes of someone trained to find advantage in every situation. "Miss Whitman," Walsh said, extending his hand in greeting, "Martha Hendricks speaks highly of your potential usefulness to our operation. Please, sit down and tell us exactly what you're proposing." Eleanor shook both men's hands firmly, meeting their gazes directly, as her father had taught her to do when conducting serious business. "Gentlemen, I'm here because I believe we have mutual interests that could be served through cooperation rather than conflict." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with obvious skepticism. "And what interests might those be?" "You need to complete your survey and begin construction with minimum delays and maximum community cooperation," Eleanor replied evenly. "The displaced miners need fair compensation for their claims and protection from criminal elements that are using the chaos of displacement to prey on vulnerable people." Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Go on. I propose to serve as a liaison between your organization and the affected mining community. I would negotiate fair purchase agreements for existing claims, coordinate the orderly removal of mining equipment and personal property, and help identify criminal activities that threaten both your workers and displaced miners." Eleanor paused, studying their reactions before continuing. "In return, I would expect reasonable compensation for my services, legal protection under railroad company authority, and the opportunity to establish a permanent administrative position that could grow with your operations." Blackwood exchanged glances with Walsh before responding. "That's quite an ambitious proposal from someone who, according to our information, arrived in this territory less than a week ago with no prior experience in railroad operations or mining law." Eleanor felt a flash of the old insecurity, but pushed it aside. She'd learned too much about her own capabilities to be intimidated by conventional credentials. "You're correct that I lack direct experience in these specific areas," she acknowledged. "But I have significant experience in research, negotiation, and problem-solving. More importantly, I have the trust of the displaced miners and the ability to communicate effectively with educated professionals like yourselves. She leaned forward slightly, allowing passion to enter her voice. Gentlemen, you can complete this project through force and legal intimidation, spending months or years in court battles and dealing with sabotage and local hostility. Or you can complete it through cooperation, creating goodwill that will serve your company's interests throughout the region. Walsh smiled for the first time since the meeting began. You make a compelling argument, Miss Whitman. But talk is easy. What can you actually deliver? Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew a carefully prepared document. I've already begun preliminary negotiations with 12 claim holders in the affected area. Here are their names, the current status of their operations, their estimated fair market values, and their specific concerns about displacement. Both men leaned forward to examine the document, and Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction as she saw their expressions change from skepticism to interest. How did you gather this information? Blackwood asked. By listening to people instead of threatening them, Eleanor replied. By treating them as partners in finding solutions rather than obstacles to be removed. Walsh studied the document more carefully. These valuations, they're lower than what we expected to pay in condemnation proceedings. Because the miners understand they have limited legal recourse against railroad claims backed by federal authority, Eleanor explained. They're willing to accept reasonable compensation if they're treated with respect and given adequate time to relocate their operations. And the criminal element you mentioned? Blackwood inquired. Eleanor described her encounters with the men who had pursued her from Prosperity, as well as the broader pattern of predatory behavior Martha had described. These operations are costing you money through theft of supplies and harassment of workers. They're also creating the kind of local hostility that leads to sabotage and federal investigations. She looked directly at Walsh. I can help you identify and neutralize these threats while simultaneously improving your relations with legitimate settlers and business owners. The two men conferred quietly for several minutes, while Eleanor waited, trying to project confidence while her heart raced. With anxiety, this meeting would determine whether she could transform her desperate circumstances into genuine opportunity, or whether she would find herself back where she started, dependent on others' charity and protection. We're prepared to offer you a trial position, Walsh said finally. 30 days to prove your value, with specific benchmarks for success. What benchmarks? Eleanor asked. Blackwood consulted his notes. Successful negotiation of at least 8 claim purchases at or below the valuations you've provided. Identification and prosecution of criminal activities affecting our operations. Establishment of cooperative relationships with local law enforcement and community leaders. And compensation, Eleanor inquired, determined to discuss practical matters directly. $50 per month plus room and board, with a bonus of $10 for each claim successfully negotiated below assessed value, Walsh replied. If you prove successful during the trial period, we'll discuss a permanent position with increased responsibilities and compensation. Eleanor calculated quickly. The base salary alone was more than she had ever earned in Boston, and the potential bonuses could provide substantial additional income. More importantly, success in this position could open doors to opportunities she had never imagined. I accept, she said without hesitation. When do I begin? Immediately, Walsh replied. We'll provide you with temporary quarters and introduce you to our security chief, who will brief you on the criminal activities we've identified. You'll also meet with our survey team to understand the timeline for claim acquisitions. As the formal meeting concluded, Eleanor felt a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation. She had successfully negotiated her first professional position, but now she had to prove she could deliver on her promises. Over the following days, Eleanor threw herself into her new responsibilities with the intensity of someone who understood that failure would mean more than just professional disappointment. She studied railroad law, learned to read survey maps, and memorized the complex procedures for property acquisition and dispute resolution. More importantly, she began building relationships with the people who would determine her success or failure. Security Chief Marcus Reed proved to be a former Army sergeant with extensive experience in frontier law enforcement. He treated Eleanor with professional respect once she demonstrated her willingness to learn and her ability to ask intelligent questions. "The criminal gangs are more organized than most people realize," Reed explained during one of their planning sessions. "They're using the railroad construction as cover to move stolen goods, establish protection rackets, and recruit new members from displaced workers." Eleanor studied the reports Reed had compiled, noting patterns that her academic training helped her recognize. They're targeting people who are isolated and vulnerable, exactly the miners who are being displaced by railroad expansion. Exactly, and the local law enforcement is either overwhelmed or compromised. We need someone who can work directly with the victims to identify threats and gather evidence for prosecution. This aspect of her work proved more challenging than Eleanor had anticipated. Many of the miners were suspicious of anyone associated with the railroad, viewing her as a potential enemy despite her efforts to help them. Others were simply too frightened to provide information that might make them targets for retaliation. Eleanor's breakthrough came through her work with Sarah Chen, Tom Chen's daughter, who had arrived at the mining camp to help her father relocate his operations. Sarah was an intelligent woman in her 20s who had received some formal education but had been excluded from most professional opportunities due to racial prejudice. "The gangs recruit Chinese workers specifically," Sarah explained during one of their conversations. "They promise protection from discrimination, then use them for illegal activities while threatening their families if they try to leave." Eleanor realized that Sarah could provide insights into criminal operations that no white investigator could access. More importantly, she recognized in Sarah a kindred spirit, someone whose abilities were being wasted due to circumstances beyond her control. "Would you be willing to work with me officially?" Eleanor asked. "The railroad needs someone who can communicate with Chinese workers and understand how the criminal networks operate within their communities." Sarah's eyes lit up with interest. "They would pay me for this work. If you prove as valuable as I think you will, yes. And more than that, it could lead to other opportunities as the railroad expands into areas with significant Chinese populations." Their partnership proved immediately successful. Within a week, Sarah had identified 3 separate criminal operations and provided evidence that led to arrests by federal marshals. Eleanor's reports to Walsh and Blackwood documented not only the criminal activities, but also the broader patterns of exploitation that were undermining railroad operations. "Remarkable work," Blackwood commented as he reviewed Eleanor's latest report. "You've uncovered more criminal activity in 2 weeks than our security team identified in 3 months. Eleanor felt a surge of professional pride, but also understood that her success was creating new challenges. Word of her effectiveness was spreading throughout the region, bringing both positive and negative attention. The positive attention came from legitimate miners and settlers who began seeking her assistance with various disputes and legal problems. Eleanor found herself becoming an unofficial advocate for anyone who felt overwhelmed by the complex legal and administrative processes surrounding railroad development. The negative attention was more dangerous. Criminal organizations that had operated freely in the chaos following the dust storm were discovering that their activities were being exposed and disrupted Eleanor began receiving threatening messages and noticed suspicious figures watching her movements around the camp. "You need to be more careful," Reed warned during one of their security briefings. "These gangs don't hesitate to eliminate people they see as threats." Eleanor understood the risks, but she also understood that retreat would mean abandoning not only her own opportunities, but also the people who had come to depend on her advocacy. She was no longer just working for personal survival, but for the principle that ordinary people deserved protection from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. The crisis came when Martha Hendricks arrived at the railroad camp with urgent news. "They took Josiah," she announced without preamble. "Gang that's been operating out of the old Prosperity ruins. Left a message saying he'd be released when you stop interfering with their business." Eleanor felt ice in her veins. Josiah had risked everything to help her escape from dangerous men, and now he was paying the price for her success in disrupting criminal operations. "What exactly did the message say?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Martha handed over a piece of paper with words scrawled in crude handwriting. "Lady lawyer stops making trouble, or One Eye don't come back. We know where you sleep." Eleanor studied the message, her analytical mind working even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. "They're operating from Prosperity's ruins. That suggests they have a substantial base of operations there, probably using the buried buildings as storage and hiding places." "That's a lot of ground to search," Reed observed. "And if they're well established there, a direct assault could result in casualties among any hostages they're holding." Eleanor felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. She could withdraw from her position, cease her advocacy work, and hope that Josiah would be released safely, or she could use her growing influence and resources to strike back at the criminals who threatened everyone trying to build honest lives in the territory. "How many men can you mobilize for a rescue operation?" she asked Reed. "That depends on what kind of operation you're planning," he replied carefully. Eleanor looked around at the faces watching her, Reed, Martha, Sarah, and several other people, who had come to see her as someone who could solve problems and provide protection. They were waiting for her to demonstrate the kind of leadership that her success had implied she possessed. "I'm planning the kind that puts these criminals out of business permanently," she said with a conviction that surprised even her. "Josiah saved my life when I was desperate and alone. Now it's my turn to save his." The transformation was complete. Eleanor Whitman had evolved from a desperate mail-order bride into someone who could command respect, organize complex operations, and accept responsibility for other people's welfare. The frontier had stripped away her illusions about depending on others for protection, but it had also revealed capabilities she had never known she possessed. The rescue of Josiah Cumberland would be her greatest test yet, and potentially her most dangerous. But Eleanor no longer thought in terms of seeking safety. She thought in terms of using whatever power she had gained to protect the people who mattered to her. The woman who had once waited passively for Samuel Morrison to solve her problems was gone forever. In her place stood someone prepared to take action, accept consequences, and fight for the principles she had discovered were worth defending. The final confrontation with the forces that had threatened her since leaving Boston was about to begin. The rescue operation Eleanor planned was unlike anything the frontier had seen. A carefully coordinated effort that combined railroad resources, federal authority, and local knowledge to dismantle an entire criminal network in a single decisive strike. As dawn broke over the railroad camp, Eleanor stood before a gathering of 23 men and women who had volunteered to participate in what they all understood might be a dangerous mission. Security Chief Reed had assembled a core team of railroad security personnel, all former military men with experience in combat operations. Federal Marshal James Crawford had arrived from Denver with warrants for the arrest of known gang members and authority to prosecute federal crimes committed on railroad property. Most importantly, Eleanor had convinced 8 displaced miners to serve as guides, men who knew every hidden passage and buried structure in the ruins of Prosperity. The intelligence we've gathered indicates the gang is using the buried commercial district as their base of operations, Eleanor explained, pointing to a detailed map she had helped create. They've excavated tunnels connecting the basement levels of several buildings, creating a complex that's almost impossible to approach without being detected. Martha Hendricks, who had insisted on participating despite Eleanor's concerns for her safety, studied the map with the eye of someone who understood underground structures. Main entrance here, at what used to be the bank building, but there's also access through the old hotel basement and probably emergency exits we haven't identified. Eleanor nodded. That's why we're not attempting a direct assault. Instead, we're going to use their own tactics against them: deception, misdirection, and superior organization. The plan Eleanor had developed was based on her growing understanding of how criminal organizations operated. Rather than trying to match their violence with greater violence, she intended to exploit their weaknesses, their dependence on fear and intimidation, their assumption that legitimate authorities would not coordinate effectively, and their underestimation of the people they victimized. Phase 1, Eleanor continued, involves Marshal Crawford approaching their lookouts with a false proposition. He'll claim to represent railroad interests that want to negotiate a truce. We stop interfering with their operations in exchange for the safe return of all hostages. Crawford, a lean man with intelligent eyes and a carefully trimmed beard, nodded his understanding. That should get me close enough to assess their strength and locate where they're holding prisoners. Phase 2 involves creating a distraction, Eleanor said, turning to Sarah Chen, who had proven invaluable in gathering intelligence about the gang's operations. Sarah will arrive with news that a federal investigation is being launched from the territorial capital, with agents expected to arrive within days. This should convince them to begin evacuating their most incriminating evidence. Sarah smiled grimly. And while they're busy moving stolen goods and destroying records, they'll be vulnerable to the real operation. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. Phase 3 is the actual rescue and arrest operation, coordinated to begin when their attention is focused on the false evacuation. Reed leaned forward to study the tactical details. Simultaneous entry through 3 access points, with teams assigned specific objectives: hostage rescue, evidence seizure, and preventing escape through identified tunnel routes. Eleanor felt the weight of command as she looked around at the faces of people who were trusting her judgment with their lives and freedom. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman fleeing a failed marriage, dependent on others for protection and survival. Now she was planning and directing a complex operation that would determine the fate of not only Josiah Cumberland, but the entire regional effort to establish law and order in the aftermath of the dust storm disaster. "Are there any questions about the plan or timing?" she asked. Tom Chen raised his hand. "What happens if this gang has connections we don't know about? What if there are more of them than we expect?" Eleanor appreciated the question. It demonstrated the kind of careful thinking that would make their operation successful. "We've prepared for that contingency by coordinating with territorial authorities and railroad security forces throughout the region. If this operation exposes a larger criminal network, we're prepared to expand our efforts accordingly." Jake Morrison, one of the displaced miners, asked the question Eleanor had been hoping someone would raise. "And what happens to us after this is over, once the criminals are gone and the railroad takes our claims?" Eleanor smiled, recognizing the opportunity to address broader concerns that went beyond the immediate rescue mission. "That brings me to the final phase of our overall strategy. The railroad has agreed to establish a permanent regional security and liaison office, staffed by people who understand local conditions and can serve as advocates for legitimate settlers and business owners. She paused to let the implications sink in. Those positions will be filled by people who have proven their competence and commitment during operations like this one. People like Sarah, who understands how to work with diverse communities. People like Martha, who knows mining law and operations. People like yourselves, who know this territory and its challenges. Eleanor could see the hope kindling in their faces as they realized she was offering more than just immediate employment, but the possibility of building new careers from the wreckage of their old lives. The frontier is changing, she continued. The days of isolated prospectors and settlers operating without legal protection or institutional support are ending. What's replacing them is a more organized approach to development, one that needs people who can bridge the gap between frontier experience and administrative competence. Marshal Crawford stood up, checking his pocket watch. Time to begin. Remember, timing is critical. Each phase needs to succeed for the others to work. As the teams dispersed to their assigned positions, Eleanor felt a moment of doubt about the wisdom of what they were attempting. The plan was sound in theory, but frontier conditions had a way of creating unexpected complications. If something went wrong, people she cared about could be killed or imprisoned, and the criminal organization they were fighting would emerge stronger than before. But doubt was a luxury she could no longer afford. Josiah Cumberland was depending on her. The displaced miners were trusting her leadership, and the entire effort to establish legitimate authority in the territory hung in the balance. Eleanor had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when action was necessary. 2 hours later, Eleanor positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the ruins of Prosperity, using a spyglass to monitor the operation's progress. Through the lens, she could see Marshal Crawford approaching the gang's lookouts, with his hands visible and his demeanor suggesting peaceful intentions. The conversation that followed was too distant to overhear, but Eleanor could read the body language of the participants. Initial suspicion gave way to interest as Crawford presented his false proposition. After several minutes of discussion, one of the lookouts disappeared into the ruins, presumably to consult with leadership. Phase 1, proceeding as planned, Eleanor whispered to Martha, who crouched beside her with her own spyglass trained on different sections of the ruins. 20 minutes later, Sarah Chen appeared at the edge of the ruins, moving with the urgent pace of someone carrying important news. Eleanor watched as Sarah was escorted into the underground complex, beginning the critical second phase of their operation. "Now we wait," Eleanor murmured, checking her own pocket watch. They had calculated that the gang would need at least 30 minutes to begin any significant evacuation efforts, providing the window necessary for the rescue teams to get into position. The waiting was the hardest part. Eleanor found herself thinking about all the decisions that had led to this moment. Her choice to answer Samuel Morrison's advertisement, her refusal to return to Boston after the disaster, her acceptance of Josiah's help and protection, her decision to work with the railroad rather than seek easier alternatives. Each choice had seemed isolated at the time, driven by immediate necessity rather than long-term planning. But now she could see the pattern they had created, the gradual transformation from dependent victim to independent agent, from someone who sought protection to someone who provided it for others. "Movement," Martha reported, interrupting Eleanor's reflections. "Looks like they're bringing up crates and bundles. Sarah's message is working." Eleanor focused her spyglass on the main entrance to the underground complex, where several men were, indeed, emerging with what appeared to be stolen goods and records. The sight filled her with satisfaction. The gang was reacting exactly as she had predicted, abandoning their defensive positions to protect their accumulated wealth. "Signal the teams," Eleanor told the runner, who had been assigned to coordinate communications. "Phase 3 begins now." What followed was a masterpiece of coordinated action. 3 teams of armed men emerged simultaneously from concealed positions, moving toward their assigned objectives with the precision of a military operation. The gang's lookouts, distracted by the evacuation efforts, were caught completely off guard. Eleanor watched through her spyglass as Security Chief Reed's team secured the main entrance, while Marshal Crawford's federal agents moved to arrest the gang leadership. Most importantly, she saw a third team emerge from what had been the hotel basement, escorting 3 figures she recognized as hostages, including Josiah Cumberland. The one-eyed prospector was limping and appeared to have been roughed up, but he was alive and moving under his own power. Eleanor felt a surge of relief so intense it left her momentarily dizzy. The entire operation was over in less than 15 minutes. The gang's leadership was in custody, their stolen goods were secured as evidence, and their underground complex was under federal control. More importantly, the network of fear and intimidation they had used to terrorize the region was broken. As Eleanor and Martha made their way down to the ruins to assess the results, they encountered a scene of controlled celebration. The rescued hostages were receiving medical attention. The arrested criminals were being processed by Marshal Crawford's team, and the volunteer participants were sharing the satisfaction of a difficult mission successfully completed. Josiah Cumberland spotted Eleanor approaching and limped over to meet her, his weathered face split by a grin that made his missing eye seem like a badge of honor rather than a disability. "Heard you organized this whole rescue operation," he said, clasping her hand in both of his. "Mighty impressive work for someone who claimed to be just a stranded mail-order bride." Eleanor laughed, feeling the last vestiges of that old identity finally falling away. "I'm learning that people can be more than they originally appear, especially when circumstances give them the chance to prove it." "Truer words were never spoken," Josiah agreed. "Question is what happens next. This operation's going to make you famous throughout the territory. Railroad's going to want to keep you, federal marshals are going to want to recruit you, and every settlement with problems is going to come asking for help." Eleanor considered his words as she looked around at the scene of their victory. Success brought opportunities, but it also brought responsibilities and expectations that could become as confining as the limitations she had originally fled. "I suppose that depends on what kind of life I want to build," she said thoughtfully. "I came west looking for security and conventional happiness. Instead, I found something I never knew I wanted, the chance to matter, to make a difference. In circumstances that require everything I have to give." Marshal Crawford approached them, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal respect. "Miss Whitman, I've received authorization to offer you a permanent position with the Federal Marshal Service. Regional Coordinator for Frontier Law Enforcement, based wherever you think you can do the most good." The offer was flattering and potentially lucrative, but Eleanor found herself hesitating. Federal employment would provide security and status, but it would also mean working within bureaucratic constraints that might limit her ability to respond quickly to local needs. "I'm honored by the offer, Marshal Crawford," she replied carefully, "but I'd like to explore other possibilities before making such an important commitment." Chief Engineer Walsh had witnessed the conversation and stepped forward with his own proposal. "The railroad is prepared to offer you a regional management position, Miss Whitman. You've proven your ability to solve complex problems and coordinate diverse resources. We could use those skills throughout our Western operations." Again, Eleanor felt the appeal of the offer, but also its limitations. Railroad work would be well compensated and professionally respected, but it would mean serving corporate interests that might not always align with community needs. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh," she said. "Your confidence in my abilities means a great deal, but I think I need to consider a different approach to using what I've learned." Sarah Chen, who had been listening to the exchange, smiled knowingly. "You're thinking about starting your own operation, aren't you?" Eleanor looked at Sarah with surprise and growing excitement. "Actually, yes. I am thinking exactly that." The idea had been forming in Eleanor's mind throughout the rescue operation, crystallizing as she watched people with different skills and backgrounds work together to achieve something none could have accomplished alone. The frontier needed more than just law enforcement or railroad development. It needed organizations that could serve as bridges between different communities and interests, advocates for people who lacked institutional power, coordinators for efforts that required diverse expertise. "What kind of operation?" Martha asked, her interest obvious. "A consulting and advocacy service," Eleanor replied, the concept becoming clearer as she spoke. "We'd work with railroad companies, federal authorities, territorial governments, and local communities to solve problems that require both professional competence and frontier experience." She gestured toward the group of people who had participated in the rescue operation. "Look around. We have expertise in mining, law enforcement, federal procedures, ethnic community relations, and territorial development. We have people who can negotiate with corporate executives and people who can track criminals through buried ruins." Tom Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Combined expertise that's more valuable than any individual contribution." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "And because we'd be independent, we could serve the real interests of our clients rather than the bureaucratic interests of large institutions." Josiah grinned at the ambitious scope of her vision. "You're talking about building something that's never existed before, creating a new kind of frontier profession. Why not?" Eleanor asked. "The frontier is creating new kinds of everything else, new communities, new industries, new ways of organizing society. Why not new ways of solving the problems those changes create?" As the sun set over the ruins of Prosperity, casting long shadows across the site, where Eleanor's original dreams had been buried, she found herself surrounded by people who shared her enthusiasm for building something unprecedented. Martha agreed to manage mining and property law issues. Sarah would handle ethnic community relations and federal liaison work. Several of the rescued miners expressed interest in serving as field investigators and regional representatives. Marshal Crawford and Chief Engineer Walsh, while disappointed that Eleanor had declined their offers, both expressed willingness to work with her independent organization on a contract basis. The territorial government, they assured her, would welcome competent assistance with the complex problems of frontier development. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the office of Whitman Associates, the consulting firm she had established in the growing town of Silver Creek. Through her window, she could see the bustling streets of a community that had prospered through the kind of coordinated development her organization specialized in facilitating. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in destroyed Prosperity was gone, completely, replaced by a professional woman whose expertise was sought throughout the territory. Eleanor Whitman had built exactly the kind of meaningful life she had dreamed of, though through paths she could never have imagined. Her father would have been proud, she thought, of the way she had used her education to create opportunities rather than simply filling positions others had designed. Her mother would have approved of the independence she had achieved, the security she had earned through her own efforts rather than through dependence on others' protection. As for Samuel Morrison, the man whose letters had first drawn her west, Eleanor sometimes wondered what he would think of the woman who had arrived too late to marry him, but not too late to fulfill his vision of building something meaningful on the frontier. She suspected he would approve of the way she had turned disaster into opportunity, loss into growth, desperate flight into purposeful journey. The dust storm that had destroyed Prosperity had also swept away Eleanor's illusions about finding happiness through others' promises. What emerged from that destruction was something far more valuable. The knowledge that she could create her own opportunities, solve her own problems, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. Eleanor Whitman had come west as a mail-order bride seeking security. She had remained as an independent woman who provided security for others, who had transformed her education into expertise, her survival instincts into professional skills, and her personal journey into a model for others seeking to create meaningful lives on their own terms. The frontier had kept its promise, just not in the way she had expected. It had offered unlimited opportunity to those bold enough to seize it, wise enough to adapt to changing circumstances, and strong enough to help others do the same. Standing in her office, surrounded by the evidence of her success and the tools of her chosen profession, Eleanor smiled at the thought of the adventures still ahead. The American West was still changing, still creating new challenges that would require all the intelligence, courage, and determination she had discovered within herself. She was ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that she had learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach, that the only limitations on what a person could become were the ones they accepted for themselves. Eleanor Whitman had refused to accept any limitations at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.